Okay. I've got a little bar that's moving over here as it loads up.
Yeah, I've never actually really done this before, so this would be interesting.
Yeah. All right. And so what I need to do now is I need to make sure that this is muted. Yeah. There we go. Perfect. And I think we are live. So let's try to do this. We are still working out kinks in the system, as any of the participants could tell you, but I'm very happy to have you here today. And the topic of the day is designing pivotal historical events. So yeah, what I thought we could do is just brainstorm for a bit at the beginning, but then I want to try doing a little exercise or two in the middle to see if that would be fun. So I'm experimenting a bit now that we're on a different platform. So pivotal historical events. A little bit of background. The reason I was thinking about this is because I found when I was first writing, it was very easy to sort of invent social stuff and sort of slap it onto the page without having it seem really grounded. And one of the things that I needed to do in order to get it to be more grounded was to try to think about what kind of events might have led to those conditions, right? Now, we have tons and tons of examples in our own history of events that have happened and that have left very, very long influence trails in our current society, for example. I'm writing down a note for myself. A couple of examples. Obviously, the Civil War in United States history was a really big deal, and it has social consequences that are still extremely active in the way that our society works, right? So that's obviously that's the one that always leaps to mind first for me. But my husband recently read a book entitled The Tale of the Heike, which is a sort of an account of some historical events in Japanese history that occurred back in the 1100s through the 1300s. And not only was it very, very interesting, but as he was reading it, he and I could start to see that these events had had an enormous influence on sort of the paths that were taken by Japanese history after that point. So, for example, the name of this war in Japanese history is the Genpei War. And it was fought between a family known as the Genji and a family known as the Heike. And lots of things happened as a result of this, but one of the things that happens was that the Heike family was wiped off the face of the earth. Like, they were all killed to the last one, which is kind of shocking, but definitely revelatory. And once that has happened once, it really changes the way that people conceptualize war, for example, and the possible consequences of war. The other thing that is worth noting that happened during that period was that the capital of Japan moved from Kyoto to Kamakura. And so basically it moved from the west part of Japan to the east part of Japan, and it has never come back since. So when we say, oh, the capital of Japan is here in Tokyo in the east, it's always worth saying, well, why is that the case? And it tracks back to this series of events that happened a very, very long time ago. So that said, basically almost anything, I figure almost anything that you put into a story in terms of the facts of locations of cities or what kind of social groupings exist, those can all get sort of deepened and tracked back to some kind of sense of the history of the place that you're talking about. LaShawn, do you do a lot of secondary world stuff, or do you what's your focus?
I've been doing a lot more secondary world. The book, well, the book I finally finished. Yay!
Yay! 3 cheers.
The book I finally finished, that was a secondary world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually writing a short story that is in a secondary world right now. So, and that's interesting because I'm looking at how, when I first started writing it, it was basically, well, we've always been this way kind of deal.
Yeah.
But then the character that I have goes back and kind of finds her own history, which is actually influenced a lot by something that had occurred in earlier history that had impacted her people group. And so she's dealing with basically the consequences of that.
Sure.
So, and when I was first sitting down and figuring out, okay, how exactly do I want this history to go? At first I thought, well, maybe it takes place on a spaceship because, but the more that I brainstormed and the more I figured it out, I realized that, for instance, she goes to a market and a very pivotal scene takes place at that market. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, if that happens, then that can't really be on a spaceship, not if you're getting fresh fruits and vegetables. So, but then the fact that there is a market at all made me think, well, okay, how, exactly you have a higher, I still want it to be higher advanced civilization, but you still have these cultural, people are, highly sacred people are moving in carriages, horse and carriages. There are markets that are, paved. And that made me think, okay, well, there's a disparity here. How did that happen? And that's the fun thing about, world building is like, instead of changing, well, it has to be that, it's like, no, you can figure out, well, why is that? Something occurred that made it that way. And so you get to figure out, that, and that can be instrumental to your story.
Yeah.
So once I figured it out, it's like, ooh, that it gave me something to sort of chase down, and like sort of like a fun little detail that actually opened it up and made me go, okay, this is actually, it goes into this woman's culture a bit more as to how she is the way she is,
Yeah. And you know what, you point out that something as small as a market can just lead to an enormous amount of opportunity. And that's the kind of thing that I notice a lot.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this, was because I want to encourage anybody who watches the video to say, ooh, maybe there's just some little tiny kernel in this story that I'm writing that could lead to something really big and exciting. And the whole story takes on so much more extra dimension once you've done that.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I always point out to people is that people often talk about how, the world building that you do does not necessarily end up on the page, right? And the thing is, that's absolutely correct. But at the same time, as an author, you write differently if you know things than if you don't know things, right? And so the fact that you've done all the world building work ends up changing just the way that the words fall out on the page. And so if you know more, there will be a lot more sort of subtly implied depth to the world that sneaks in subconsciously as you write. And there isn't any need to sort of list it all out in order for that to be the case. So what about you, Tanya? Have you what kind of historical event adventures have you had in your writing?
In the novel I'm working on, this goes back to my time in Trinidad when my mom was a teacher. She had some really interesting books, and one of them was called They Came Before Columbus by Ivan van Sertima. And something that shocked me that I did not learn in school was that Columbus was actually on record as saying that Africans were in the Caribbean area and South America and Central and South America before Europeans. Because he, as somebody who pilfered Africans from the coast, was very familiar with what African culture was like. And there seemed to have been, okay, I just saw an article on it on the State of Black Science Fiction or somewhere where they were talking about African navigators who should be celebrated more than Columbus.
Yeah, in fact, I just shared that article.
Yeah, one of the people that were mentioned was a king from Mali who disappeared, and they theorized that his fleet may have ended in Brazil and in other areas in South and Central and South America. And one place they think might have been St. Vincent, because that's where my family on my mom's side is from anyway. And they're what they call Black Caribs, which is basically people who have Black and Carib ancestry, which would include my great-grandmother on my mom's side. And there was evidence of people of a relatively more industrially developed to a degree than the indigenous people in the area were at the time, and they started governing areas. I have it all down somewhere. And Ivan van Sertima, who was from Guyana, he actually went to some council that in Europe, and he talked to them at length about that kind of stuff. And I bought the book. I remember the book when I was in Trinidad, and I bought the book as an adult. And when I started writing my novel, I went through the book with a fine-tooth comb and used certain elements of the historical record, because I said, regardless of whether or not you want to believe it or not, it makes for good fiction. So the Mali king, the name does not come to mind right now. I'm in the process of revising, not composing the novel anymore.
You know what I'll do is I will go back and I will find the article and make sure that I put it in my report when when I summarize what we've talked about.
Yeah, Abu Bakari or something like that. No. Yeah, I might be messing up, but for a while I didn't quite hear if you guys defined what a secondary world is, because I've been trying to find out what a proper definition for that is. Because
you know what? We hadn't talked about that, and I think that's a perfectly fair question.
True that.
You want to tackle that, LaShawn, or should I?
You tackle it.
Okay.
I can tell you how it is. I can give you in my own words. I don't know if it's an official definition.
No, see, I don't have an official definition either. I don't have like the book of all science fiction.
Okay, well, your definition should be
here's how I understand it. Yeah. A secondary world is when you're working in a fictional environment that has humans in it, but has no connection to our world in any historical way or geological way. Like, it's like humans exist, but they exist in this completely different world.
Yeah. And it could, it doesn't necessarily have to be the same universe. Like, I think, like, what would you consider like science fiction on other worlds, secondary worlds. Basically, I've always seen it as stories that takes place in an Earth-like environment, but is not of Earth. It doesn't have the Earth history. It doesn't have the history is completely different. It could be taking place in a whole different world.
Yes.
So, and I don't know if secondary world would be considered an apt title. It's basically another world.
So it's the kind of story where, like, so for example, a lot of authors have made efforts to connect their stories back to our world in one way or another. So for example, the McCaffrey Dragon books, they started out, like they all started out with this prologue about how humans had left Earth and discovered this star system, but so much time had passed that they had completely lost all connection to Earth and the things that they had known, etc. And then that science fictional element of it only came back far later in the series. So that to me doesn't count as a secondary world, but if that prologue and that connection were not there, that would be then a secondary world. So my Varan world is a secondary world.
Right, and I read that. I knew that it was going to get picked up. I was like, if that don't get picked up, I'll eat my hat. And I think I posted it.
Thank you, Tanya.
And I posted as such on Facebook, at least. I remember, if I recall correctly. So, yeah.
Yeah, so Varan is definitely secondary world, and I'll tell you a funny story about something that made me discover history about it. Initially, when I wrote it, it was years and years ago, and I wasn't really thinking very hard because I was a beginner, and I had inadvertently made everybody have the same religion.
Ooh.
Okay. And I was like, okay, that's all very well, but if they have the same religion, there has to be a reason for that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I guess this is an interesting point to bring up, because something that seems like an immediate red flag in world building can just be like, well, if you want to keep this one thing, if you have a really solid explanation for it, that's fine. So at a certain point, I was like, well, the people of Varan were religious fugitives from another place on their planet. And so they had sort of defined their group by a common religion before they went off and got lost and ended up where they are now. Obviously, you'd have sort of changes and maybe splintering and heresies and stuff like that over time. But I wanted a reason for them to be starting from a sort of common religious cultural background, in a sense. And then once they got there, of course, there were new belief systems that popped up and all that kind of thing. But so that was something that for me was a big fault in the original version. But I was like, this is an opportunity to go back in time and think about what kind of a pivotal historical event might have led to this. And I did have fun with that. And it actually helped me because I wanted also to make sure that the people of Varan had a certain degree of phenotypical diversity. And I was able to say, well, when these people left, they had people from all kinds of different regions of this area who shared their same religion. And so when it came time to pack up because there were problems and they were being persecuted, there was quite a diverse group from these various different places that decided to go off and try to, found their promised land, in a sense. So anyway, it turned out to be more interesting than I had initially planned, which is obviously for the best on the long term. I think the biggest thing that changed the way I wrote was going into anthropology and linguistics. right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I would, you know, study of culture and comparative culture and post-colonial discourse and all kinds of very interesting stuff, and then study of language and language structure and language change, etc. It's all been.
I wanted to stop you right there and ask a question.
Sure.
What was it like stepping into the post-colonial waters?
What was it like?
Yeah.
Oh, it was such a relief.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, like, I mean, it's like having this huge blind spot and it suddenly goes away, right?
Okay.
I don't know. I find the post-colonial waters to be infinitely more interesting. You know.
So you didn't resist it at all, but then again, you chose to study it. So that's you probably.
I did choose to study it,
right.
And I mean, so anybody who is white has to do some sort of self-examination, and there's a lot of stuff that we have from our experiences growing up in the culture that needs to be interrogated, and you can't interrogate it as a kid, and you sort of have to grow up and learn to like self-interrogate. But I find that process, you know, challenging but really interesting, right? And I was so happy that when I went into anthropology, they were finally getting rid of the whole Indiana Jones approach to life. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, so that was really interesting.
Doesn't just belong in a museum; it belongs in the culture. They give it back to the culture, kind of thing. But anyway,
yeah, absolutely, yeah. But what that does bring me to is when you have these pivotal historical events, their impact is not just on, well, you know, this is where people went afterwards and, you know, that sort of thing. It's also people speak differently and new terms get invented and new kinds of, you know, there can be new splits in a population, or there can be all kinds of changes that are reflected in language. And I find that really fascinating to look at. So, you know, I mean, let's see. I'm wandering a bit in my brain. But I kind of
you're not going off on a tangent. It's related.
I like tangents though. They're super interesting. Well, I mean, so okay, so I had this exercise that I wanted to sort of, you know, sort of thought exercise, right? So you have this world, and in this world you have two groups of people who are different from each other in some way, right? And group A and group B, right?
Okay.
The valuable thing to do at that point is like, oh, great, I've got these two groups of people. Take a look at how you've made them different from one another, and then try to say, okay, where did these distinctions arise, right? So if you have two groups of people, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I want to just sort of walk through the process a little bit and say, you know, is it because they have different geographical origins? Or
first of all, do you want to, the very first thing, or is it ethnic? Is it racial?
Right.
Do you want to start off with that? Or are they within the same ethnic group? If they're in the same racial group but have different ethnic, like different ethnicities, how would you define that?
Yeah. Or, I'm not writing this down well. Or, you know, if they're similar in a lot of ways, but they have different religions, for example. You know, you can say, okay, well, you know, what caused this change? Was it some kind of colonization, right? Was it an invasion? There's so
Or
many
you can
options.
you can have one group that is faith-based and one group that is not.
Yep.
And what, you know, well, it's sort of cliche-ish, but that one group that's not is more. Of course, you can switch it up. Hold on.
Do it.
Well,
Do it.
sorry, I'm brainstorming now. It's like, okay, so you have the non-faith based who are more logical and they're based on science, but they treat it as a religion,
Mm.
as opposed the more faith-based group is more. It's not. It would be considered more natural, so to speak.
Mm. Well, it reminds me, in fact, you remind me of our discussion with J.M. Fry a couple weeks ago, because she has these different groups in her, war scenario. And one is an indigenous group whose land was invaded by two conflicting powers, right? But the two conflicting powers, one has a mother goddess, and then the other one, follows the 7 principles of science or what. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was interesting because it was kind of like a science-based faith in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't done a lot of secondary world stuff. I've done more along the lines of alternate history. So I'll
Yeah.
be half listening, half contributing.
No, but
So,
see, here's the thing.
yeah.
Alternate history is absolutely this topic.
Oh, totally. You could.
What?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
like where's the divergence point? That is like the ultimate question, right?
My story, the story that's in the best of anthology, the Rosetta Tharpe and Memphis Mini story.
Yes.
That is an alternate history story, and that was for me. What I did was when I was trying to figure out how to do the story, I had introduced an element that was not. It certainly didn't happen in the past. What came about was that I was researching. I had come across Rosetta Tharpe and her music, and learned that and fell in love with her music. Seeked out more and learned about Memphis Mini, and I learned that at some point in the early 1900s, they both lived together and they both lived in Chicago. Um, and I was like, whoa, that would make a great story. Okay,
Yeah.
how do I do it? And one of the things like, well, I have to find a way to make it so that they stayed in Chicago, because Rosetta in real life moved to New York in 19, oh gosh, I want to say 1930, 1929. It's been a long time since I've looked at my research.
No, that's right.
Right.
Actually, no, 1919, like early 1920s, she moved to New York. And that was when her career really took off.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, I need to make it so that she stays in Chicago instead of going to Chicago. Well, what will make someone stay in Chicago? And the only thing that I can think of was a quarantine. If they were ordered by the government to stay in one spot. And I was like, okay, well, if there was some kind of illness coming about, what would that look like? And for some reason, I was, I'm being called to dinner. I'll make this quick.
Okay.
But yeah, basically, long story short, I came up with the idea of this virus that has an appearance of people who are dead. And if they explode, they can kill people. And the only way to get rid of them was if you had a unique sounding voice. And so singers, the normal singers who would be, you know, who would normally be singing would be conscripted by the government to actually help help exterminate these, I call them stumps. So, and that got me to thinking, okay, well then how does that affect, history then?
Yeah.
And that was a fun thing, because like, I have, all in it kind of then took off on a tangent. All these famous singers that, Bing Crosby, the Andrews sisters, they wouldn't be as popular. They're now conscripted as exterminators now. And
Yeah.
And there's a tidbit where, because a singing voice could have the potential to create stumps and create, more disease, that would mean that big bands would become more popular because singing would be more restricted. And so that was fun, just playing with that idea was really, really fun. And, I brought in a little bit of prohibition history into it. And it became sort of, it was like our world, but it went in different paths. So yeah, and all that, and all this is taking place around World War II.
Mm-hmm.
How would it affect that? So just thinking about not just the big history points, but just the little history points, and seeing how that will go.
Right.
Things that don't seem they if you don't think about it, but if they're still affected.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you could take that to some interesting places.
Very interesting places. Absolutely. Yeah. I think I'm so glad alternate history came up.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I mentioned it, because I was wondering why Beneath Caesar Skies gave me a personalized rejection for a story I sent. Because according to the definition you guys gave, it sounded like it was not quite its own world, despite being human-like. It was alternate. So now I understand why.
Yep. And I'm sorry, ladies, but I have to go.
All right. Well, thank you, LaShawn. It was great. Enjoy your dinner.
Okay. Yep.
Bye, LaShawn. Nice meeting you.
Bye.
Bye. Nice meeting you.
So Tanya, one of my favorite things is to try to figure out, when I'm reading an alternate history, where the major divergence points have been.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely.
For example, I wrote the first story that I managed to sell. That was my first sale. It wasn't a professional one, but it was a semi-pro one to a really respectable Canadian market called Postscripts to Darkness. It's the one I was mentioning before that got used in the Seashells and Tanana Reeves courses. I've written about 9 other stories in that world. 6 of them have been published professionally and non-professionally, semi-pro. It is alternate. The thing that makes it different is that everyone is born with a specific magical ability. They may have similarities with other people's abilities and stuff. So like people who can manipulate rocks and stuff may end up going into construction or something like that. And one of the stories that of mine that got longlisted for the Vanderbilt short story award here in Canada. It's named after what's his name from the scene, and his mom is was Vanderbilt. What's his name? It's
I don't.
Anderson Cooper, his brother who died of suicide.
Yeah.
It's named after his brother, Chris Carter. Anyway, it got longlisted for that award. In that story, she can enter people's dreams. So she uses that as part of therapy to help people recover.
Oh, cool.
From various traumas and help with mental illnesses and stuff like that. That one, I understand now why it got longlisted for that award. It's because it's very literary. It really straddles the line, and I didn't realize it did that. At that point, until I started reading other things from the magazine, like the other story that won this year or last year, I think it was. So that's the main divergence for me in those stories. The ones that managed to be my first professional sale, I actually started writing because Nalo had an anthology back in 2003, 2004 called So Long Been Dreaming. And she said I can write, she had said try writing something for it. And at that point I had the ambition, but not the chops to pull it off.
Yeah, here you
Everyone's kept saying it was very interesting. And then people would say, you can cut it down. And it ended up being my first professional sale 2 years ago to Book Smugglers. That I used the premise for that as in, what if Egypt never stopped being a superpower? Because not a lot of North Americans know this, but Egypt was the place where, like, say, Greece and Rome learned, like Pythagoras' theorem that's named after him. Where did it came from? Somewhere. You can't build something on ground that resists earthquakes and lasts for thousands of years without having some sort of advanced mathematical knowledge of the terrain. Which requires all sorts of different disciplines converging together. But yeah. So what if they never stopped being a world superpower? What would that be like?
Yeah.
So I sort of integrated a lot of, at that point I was not an atheist yet. And I used to visit a lot of New Age. There's one particular New Age store across from the Toronto Library. And there were interesting books there. And I went in there, around that time, there was still a New Age store, on across the street from the Toronto Library, reference library. And there was I started going, okay, this, even, regardless of whether this is true or not, this makes for good fiction. So I started incorporating it into my novel, and I started finding out about cymatics, which is fascinating. So sound and music are very important to this particular story. And it became my first sale, and years later.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it taught me that I probably shouldn't go after themed anthologies and themed because you end up with a lot of themed stuff that you can't find a home for.
Well, that is true.
Yeah. So
before, I want to mention, just while I still have time, I want to mention that I recently read Beth Cato's series.
Okay, Breath of Earth.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting alternate history scenario too. But one of the things that I found most interesting about it was that, given that it was set in 1906, that, like, a lot of the stuff that I expected to see in it was stuff that I normally see in things like World War II alternate history scenarios.
Oh, okay.
This was like a significant chunk of time earlier than that. And what it did was it added an extra layer of complexity because I couldn't necessarily pinpoint precisely where the divergences had occurred in my own knowledge of history.
Oh, okay.
But I thought it was very interesting because the way she had Japan and the United States actually allying, and so she had really changed a lot of the geopolitical variables as she was going into a set of historical events that actually occurred, at least geologically, a lot the way that, right, a lot in the sequence that they had actually occurred in the real world.
Okay.
So yeah, I thought that was really cool.
Wow. That's just another thing on my to be read pal. I think I have one of her books in my Kindle library, if not the Breath of Earth one.
Yeah, I just read the whole series and it's definitely worth a look.
Is it steampunk or diesel punk?
You know, it's really interesting. It's kind of steampunky. But it's not associated with Victorian era England at all, which is one of the sort of usual characteristics of steampunk. So maybe diesel punk because it's a little bit later time-wise. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, but I mean, effectively, it has airships and it has a bunch of different stuff. And the magic is this geologic magic, and so she ties the geologic magic into the steampunk aspects of it as well. So it is actually, I mean, yes, it's steampunk flavored, but it's got its own really interesting vibe to it.
Wow. I'm sort of knee deep in cyberpunk and Weird Western research, so that'll just have to wait.
Well, you know, we all have limited amounts of free time.
Yeah, and then
Well, very cool. Very cool. It's hitting 5 o'clock, and I don't. I know that people usually have things to do around this time, so I am going to thank you for being here. It was lovely to have you participate. I'm so glad you could meet LaShawn and that LaShawn will be here as well. Obviously, I'm still working the kinks out of the meeting technology, but I think I'm getting better, and I'm going to make sure that what happened with Kate today is not going to happen again. I can go in and change some settings when I'm not in the middle of a meeting, and I'll be able to get that worked out. So next week we'll meet on Tuesday at 4. I don't have a current plan for the topic, but see us on the Discord server, and we'll talk about it there. Okay? Thanks so much, Tanya.
No problem. It's a good thing I showed up. Oh, damn.
Yeah, I know. What would I do without you? All right, have a great.
And I actually had something to contribute. I was afraid I'd be.
I loved it. I loved every word. So I'm
really glad, because that's the thing that makes me scared. Is I rather not just be a live body saying nothing, which doesn't really add much to the broadcast. So I'd rather be here when I can have something to say and just, it was
great.
No problem.
All right. Thank you so much.
No problem. I'll see you on Facebook.